My question arises from a conversation I had with my daughter recently, who's in her mid-20s and was facing a big decision that she had to make in her career. And so she came to me for advice, and we were talking about, how to make a good decision objectively and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things she asked me about was how to pray, seeking God's help when you're making a decision. And the one thing she said that I really didn't know how to respond was when you hear people say things like, well, I had this decision, and so I took it to God, and, I asked him to give me a sign, and he did, and, then everything was, of course, wonderful because I did what, God had told me to do. And, she said, when I try that, it doesn't work. And then, I think sometimes it can make people even lose their faith or falter because they think, okay, well, these people are getting their prayers answered. And, how come, God isn't talking to me on a megaphone or something like he seems to be with these other people. And then kind of dovetailing off of that is I've really been thinking a lot about how you have spoken lately about meditating on the words of Christ in the Our Father, and really, that shows us all the ways to pray. However, then there are times that I do think, like St. Paul says, to pray without ceasing, and there are, very small things that I find myself praying to, God, help me find this lost item, or, things that obviously aren't in the Lord's Prayer. So could you just speak about that? I don't want to pray in a frivolous nature, and I certainly don't want to, lead my children into that type of thing either.
Mm-hmm.
If all that makes sense.
Yeah, these are great questions. They're fabulous questions. They really go to the heart of Christian spirituality, so I deeply appreciate them. There was a major shift in the cultural milieu of Western Christianity that took place, say, probably in the last 30 years. And this was the shift. The shift was towards a type of spirituality where people had an expectation that God would, as a matter of course, give them some kind of private revelation for the determination of day-to-day decisions, right? And some of them might conceptualize that as hearing a voice in their head, or maybe a strong impression or a feeling, or they would be looking for signs that they would discern in their experience. But however they worked it out, the expectation was that, if I need to know, what flavor mustard to buy at the grocery store, I can send up a query and I'll get back a reliable answer. And so there are any number of books and seminars that are available in the wider sort of Christian orbit, and I'm not limiting this to Catholicism by any stretch of the imagination, that purport to tell people how to read the tea leaves, so to speak, to discern reliably the voice of God. Now, I am, as you've probably discerned, unbelievably skeptical of that enterprise. I'm unbelievably skeptical of it. I think what often tends to happen is that one of two things. One is that when people operate that way, they merely stipulate, okay, when I get this feeling, that means that God is talking to me.
Okay.
Right? And so then once you've persuaded yourself in advance that there's some sort of infallible set of criterion that whenever you experience them, that just means God's talking to you, well, then you're always going to hear God talking to you, but it's only by this form of stipulation, right?
Sure.
And it's a bit like playing make-believe. When a child says, okay, let's let this chair stand for a lion. So, if you step on that chair, you get eaten. And as long as you operate within the terms of the game, you can reliably discern the presence of the lion, so to speak, right? But it all depends on the stipulation and then the willing suspension of disbelief. Like I'm going to ignore the fact that it doesn't look anything like a lion.
Right.
That's how this functions. Now, the games of make-believe are harmless. The problem with this when applied to the life of prayer is that you make a pact with yourself, and all this takes place unconsciously, right? You make a pact with yourself to turn off the critical faculty. the child has an ability to step out of the game of make-believe when it's dinner time and actually sit in the chair and have dinner without being consumed by the lion, right? But the superstitious Christian has made a pact with himself not to turn off that critical faculty. And so they commit themselves in advance to pursuing a course of action that is basically grounded in something akin to, to reading tea leaves or casting cracked bones or something. And then when circumstances don't work out as they had anticipated, then they double down on their interpretation, lest their religious identity be threatened. And it can it's prey to all kinds of confirmation bias and other forms of delusion. And I speak about this passionately because I have fallen prey to this in my own prayer life. And there have been episodes in my life when I was running in these circles and I felt like, I have to have these tangible evidences of God's direction in my life, down to very specific instances. And so I'll stipulate these conditions. If this happens, that means God's talking to me or God's leading me. And the downstream consequences of that are very bad. And when people rely on these kind of techniques to make very large life decisions, like who should I marry, should I take this job, how many children should I have, then it can be, rather than being guided by reason, which Thomas Aquinas tells us is the rule for human action, right? Not weird, spooky intuitions, but reason, right? And reason is responsive prudently to things like counsel, right, and experience. Instead of that, then I'm relying on these really irrational things, and I can do all kinds of harm to myself. The other thing that people will do, I think, sometimes in prayer, is and this is particularly when they're trying to discern the will of God from a set of circumstances. Circumstances are always inherently ambiguous, and they're nearly infinite in variety. I mean, in any given moment in my life, there's so many things that could occupy my sphere of awareness that I have to be very selective in what I pay attention to. And so we typically get drawn to what's flashy or what's familiar, and we ignore lots of other things.
Sure.
And so my ability to discern some salient fact of my experience and then reason from that infallibly to the will of God is really a con that I'm pulling over on myself. And what it subjects me to is having an intuition or a deep desire that I want to be God's will, and then looking around for confirmation of that fact in my circumstances, ignoring all the contrary signs and evidences and zeroing in on that one salient fact that would seem to justify my predetermined decision or outcome. And when you've reasoned with somebody like this, hey, I really don't think you should leave your wife and run away with the department secretary. Oh no, God told me. You get that kind of craziness, right? So I'm very down on that. It is fine. It's the teaching of Scripture that we should pray at all times. Now, Catholic writers through the centuries have given many different interpretations to that command. Obviously, it cannot mean that we keep up a conscious verbal dialogue 24/7 with God. It's impossible. It's physically impossible to do, right? So that can't be what it means. St. Augustine teaches that it basically means that we cultivate a habitual desire to be united to God. And so prayer can take the form of verbally articulated prayers, but more importantly, it's the disposition that I have to do the will of God and be united with Him. That's essentially what it means to pray without ceasing. Now, there's no reason you should not pray verbally with these little ejaculatory prayers moment to moment about things like the lost car keys or whatever else it might be. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But the essential point is that I'm seeking to be united with the will of God in my life. Now, talking about the Lord's Prayer, and this again is the teaching of St. Augustine, the purpose of the Lord's Prayer, and in fact of all prayer, is not so much to get what I want as it is to change what I want. And so when it comes to things like how do I make decisions in prayer and how does prayer play into that, rather than going to God with, do I go to law school or do I go on the mission field? I'm now going to toss my Bible in the air and see what chapter and verse falls open in front of me. That'd be kind of a superstitious way to try to read tea leaves. Rather, I want the life of prayer and the whole practice of the faith to come to condition my values so that I can make a reasonable judgment about what are my gifts, what are my talents, What are my charisms? What are my desires? How do I think I can best serve God in the world? What's my vocation? And then you make a reasonable judgment, a prudent judgment, taking counsel with wise people, seeking to follow examples, an honest assessment of what my strengths and weaknesses are, so that my decisions, while not infallible, are grounded in reason and good sense and a proper sense of vocation to Catholic life.